Why is there a second key tucked beneath the workbench? Margaret's hand trembled as she held the tarnished brass key, wrapped in a faded cloth, the metal cool and heavy in her palm. Rain dripped from the eaves of the abandoned garage, the asphalt puddled and glinting like fractured glass, while the wind carried the scent of wet wood and rust through the cracked windows. For 20 years, this place had been forgotten, coated in dust, oil stains, and the faint odor of gasoline that refused to fade. She stared at the workbench, at the toolboxes lined haphazardly with decades of neglect, and felt the weight of her life pressing down. A husband who left for someone younger, a house she had built with her own hands lost, and a cardboard box of personal belongings crammed into the back of her rusted Ford pickup. The key in her hand promised a secret she couldn't yet understand, a possibility buried under years of disuse and silence. That morning, the gray light seeped through the clouds as she turned the ignition of her pickup for the third time, the engine coughing and shivering, echoing her own exhaustion. 3 days earlier, Margaret had packed the last of her clothes into a cardboard box, stacked the photo albums and her mother's chipped coffee mugs beside the envelope holding the deed to her father's garage, and locked the door to the home she once shared with a man who no longer wanted her presence. Bills lay unopened on the kitchen counter, reminders of utilities she couldn't pay, the phone lines quiet but threatening, and a bag of prescriptions for her hypertension and arthritis that she had no idea how she would fill. Each step toward the garage was punctuated by the creak of the porch boards and the cold bite of wind through her coat. She had $211 left in her account, a rough estimate of months of sacrifice, now dangling like a thread against the storm. The garage loomed, paint peeling in long strips, glass panes fractured, hinges rusted, a place everyone else had written off. But Margaret's memory of summer days spent helping her father repair engines and restore classic cars made the air shimmer with possibility. Her fingers brushed the edge of the workbench, following the faint scratches and dents as if they were breadcrumbs meant for her alone. The key's presence stirred something inside her, a fragment of hope, a tangible connection to her father, and the first clue that her life might yet twist in a direction she hadn't imagined. The mailbox, leaning and empty, rattled in the wind, and she noticed a small, folded note tucked beneath the ledge, unsigned and yellowed with age, the edges curling like dry leaves. She lifted it carefully, heart hammering, and the words scrawled in familiar handwriting sent a chill down her spine. Some doors only open for those who remember the past. Her breath caught, and she knew that whatever waited inside the garage was no longer just a relic of memory, but a choice she had to make. A first step into a story that might finally return what life had taken away. The paper in her hand trembled before she even fully unfolded it. A county notice stamped in red ink, final property confirmation pending, her name printed with a misspelling that made it feel even more humiliating, like she no longer deserved to be written correctly. "You have 30 days to vacate any remaining claim," the clerk had said earlier that afternoon, sliding the document across the counter without looking up from her phone. Margaret stood there in the government office under fluorescent lights that hummed like a tired machine, holding her cardboard box tighter against her hip. Inside it were the only things she had been allowed to take from her marriage: a chipped ceramic mug, 2 photo albums missing pages, and a folded sweater that still carried the faint smell of her former home. $211.37 sat frozen in her bank account, not enough to cover even 2 weeks of a cheap motel in town. Her husband's lawyer had called the division fair, a word that tasted like metal in her mouth, while the man himself had already moved into a house she had once helped paint, already replaced her presence with silence and someone younger laughing in the background of photographs she was no longer in. When she stepped outside, the wind hit her like a reminder of how little she now belonged anywhere. She walked to her rusted Ford pickup parked at the edge of the lot, its passenger door still stuck halfway from last winter, and dropped the cardboard box onto the cracked seat beside the envelope containing her father's deed. The garage keys pressed hard against her palm through her coat pocket, a weight she kept touching without thinking, as if checking it was still real. 3 hours earlier, she had tried to call a rental office, only to be told her credit history showed instability concerns, followed by a polite suggestion to try short-term accommodations elsewhere. Even the shelter had a waiting list. There was no tone of cruelty in their voices, only the kind of distance that made rejection feel like procedure. Back at what was once her home, the porch light no longer worked, and a handwritten notice from the landlord still flapped on the door she had already emptied. Utilities to be disconnected, locks to be changed. Inside, the echo of her footsteps had sounded too large for the empty rooms, like the house itself was already forgetting her. Now, sitting in the driver's seat of her truck, Margaret unfolded the deed again under the dim glow of the dashboard light. The paper was thin, creased at the edges, her father's name barely visible where ink had faded with time. A faint stamp near the bottom caught her attention. A secondary parcel reference she had never noticed before, marked in a different ink, almost like an afterthought added years later by someone who didn't want it seen. She leaned closer, squinting, and felt a strange tightening in her chest when she realized the code did not match any property listing she remembered. Behind her, in the bed of the truck, the cardboard box shifted slightly as the wind pressed through the cracked tailgate, and for a moment she thought she heard the garage key clink softly against metal, like it was answering something she hadn't yet asked. The glow of the dashboard light faded into a dull amber as Margaret sat motionless in her pickup, the deed still open across her lap like something fragile enough to tear with a breath. The strange parcel code she had found earlier burned in her mind, repeating itself like a warning she could not decode. Outside, the county office building emptied slowly, employees leaving in pairs, their laughter echoing across the parking lot like it belonged to another world entirely. She finally turned the key in the ignition, the engine coughing twice before settling into a tired rumble, and drove without a destination until the familiar outline of her father's old garage emerged at the edge of town, standing alone like something the world had forgotten to finish tearing down. The metal sign above it hung crooked, the word service missing its last letter, and the windows were clouded so heavily with dust that even daylight looked uncertain inside. A handwritten notice from the county was taped to the front door. Tax delinquent property listed for sale. Sold as is. No warranties. No liability. Margaret stepped out slowly, boots crunching against gravel mixed with broken glass, and felt the weight of every failure behind her pressing closer with each step. Her phone had stopped ringing days ago, her husband's final message still unread, and the bank had already declined the last attempt to extend her overdraft. Inside the truck, $211.37 would not survive another week of motel rates, and she knew it. The key in her coat pocket felt heavier now, as if it had absorbed the silence of the place waiting for her. When she pushed the garage door, it resisted first, then gave way with a grinding metallic scream that echoed down the empty street. Dust exploded into the air, thick enough to catch the weak light filtering through the broken roof panels. Inside, everything was frozen in time. A rusted hydraulic lift, oil stains shaped like dark maps across the concrete floor, and old tool cabinets lined up like sentinels guarding nothing of value. A faded auction tag still hung from one of the machines, marked with a price so low it felt like an insult. $750, scribbled beside the words, "No inspection guaranteed." Someone had written "junk" in black marker across the corner of a metal shelf. Behind her, a passing car slowed for half a second, and she heard a man's voice laugh before it disappeared down the road. Margaret stood still, letting the sound of dripping water from a broken pipe fill the space around her like a ticking clock, then walked deeper inside, tracing her fingers across the edge of a workbench where her father once taught her how to rebuild engines from pieces others had thrown away. A cracked county map was pinned crookedly on the wall, and she noticed a red circle drawn around the garage's parcel number, darker than anything else on the page, as if someone had returned to it more than once. At the counter, she placed the deed down beside a layer of dust so thick it left clean fingerprints behind, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was holding something worthless. She looked at the locked storage cabinet in the far corner, its handle slightly bent, as though someone had forced it open long ago and never properly closed it again, and without knowing why, she stepped forward and placed the old brass key into her palm, realizing that this place everyone had dismissed had been waiting for her name far longer than she had ever known. Margaret pushed the creaking garage door the rest of the way open, the metal groaning like it remembered decades of engines revving and tires spinning. Dust swirled around her boots, and the faint scent of gasoline and old motor oil hit her first, sharp and almost nostalgic. Light filtered through cracked windows, illuminating the chipped paint on the walls, a calendar frozen on June 1978, and a rusted pump leaning crookedly in the corner, its hose still coiled like a sleeping serpent. She placed her cardboard box on the cracked concrete floor and unfolded a thin blanket over a dry patch of dirt near the back wall, tucking her coat tightly around her shoulders as the cold wind whistled through gaps in the warped wooden panels. A faded sign reading "Service" hung above a doorway, letters half peeled away, and a small coffee mug, stained with old grounds, teetered precariously on the edge of a shelf. Margaret checked the outlet near the wall, flicking the old switch, sparks jumping and buzzing as the single bulb above her flickered, casting the room in intermittent shadows. She counted her remaining cans of soup, placing them in a neat row, and ran a hand over the dusty workbench, noticing a scratch along the edge that didn't match the years of wear elsewhere. The lockers along the side wall were dented, one door slightly ajar, a nest of dried leaves tucked into the hinge, and the faint smell of rust made her wrinkle her nose. As she stepped carefully over floorboards that groaned under her weight, she noticed a section of wall near the back corner that looked newer, the paint less faded, and a thin panel appeared to have been replaced at some point, standing out subtly against the rest. The key in her coat pocket suddenly felt heavier, as if vibrating with anticipation, and she bent down to examine the baseboard near the panel, catching a shadow shift and the faintest sound of a hollow echo behind the wall. Margaret's breath hitched, and she straightened slowly, glancing around the garage. It was as if the space itself had exhaled a warning, whispering that she was not entirely alone in the silence, and that the secrets waiting here had been watching her approach. Margaret knelt on the cracked concrete floor, her palms raw and splintered from picking up shards of glass from the broken window beside the workbench. Each sweep of the broom stirred up a haze of dust and the lingering scent of old motor oil, clinging to the fibers of her threadbare coat. She moved carefully, placing every broken bottle, discarded rag, and bent tool into a plastic bin she had dragged from the back corner, all the while counting her remaining cans of soup and checking the tiny flashlight with its dying 3% battery. A thin drizzle pattered on the tin roof, rhythmically tapping above her like a metronome, making the damp smell of rust and wet wood sharper. She climbed onto a low stool to inspect a loose panel on the ceiling, prying it carefully with a screwdriver she had found in one of the drawers, and noticed a faint outline of a rectangle that didn't match the rest of the boards, the paint slightly newer, almost imperceptibly brighter. Her knees ached, her shoes soaked from the puddles forming near the garage door, and her fingers shook as she replaced a flickering light bulb with a bulb scavenged from the back of the storage cabinet. As she did, she discovered a small envelope wedged between two planks of the tool shelf, edges frayed and yellowed. A receipt slipped inside bore the name of someone she did not recognize, scrawled hastily, dated over a decade ago. She paused, brushing the dust from the paper, trying to rationalize it as a misfiled artifact of her father's old business. While tightening a duct tape strap to hold the warped door closed against the wind, she felt a faint click beneath her hand, and when she looked down, a tiny key had fallen from a gap in the counter she hadn't noticed before. Margaret lifted it slowly, examining the metal, noting the unfamiliar scratches along its shaft, and realized the key clearly did not belong to any lock she had seen. She froze as the wind rattled the metal roof above her, and the dull hum of an old refrigerator in the corner groaned like it had been sleeping for decades. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the key as nothing more than a mislaid tool, an oddity, until the subtle irregularity of the ledger page sticking out from the edge of a drawer drew her eye. A page torn, the ink smeared, and the handwriting unrecognizable. Her pulse quickened. Margaret straightened, gripping the broom in one hand and the key in the other, realizing that in clearing the debris and securing the space for herself, she had brushed against something that had been deliberately hidden, waiting for the right hands to disturb it. The torn ledger page slipped from Margaret's fingers just as the garage door creaked open behind her, letting in a blade of late afternoon light. She turned sharply, still gripping the small, unfamiliar key, her breath tight in her chest as if the building itself had learned to answer back. A man stood at the threshold. Late 60s, worn flannel shirt, grease-stained gloves tucked into his back pocket, the kind of posture that belonged to someone who had spent a lifetime leaning over engines. He held a paper grocery bag in one hand and a dented thermos in the other. "Didn't think anyone would actually come back here," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of recognition. Without waiting for permission, he stepped inside, boots crunching. Over glass she hadn't yet cleared, eyes scanning the garage like he was reading an old language on the walls. Margaret tightened her grip on the broom, instinctively guarded, and asked who he was. He nodded toward the far workbench, toward the faded outlines of tools still hanging on hooks. "Name's Harold," he said quietly. "I used to work next door. Your father, Earl, used to fix my transmission for free when my boy was in the hospital." He paused, glancing away for a moment like the memory had weight. He said, "No one in this town gets left stranded." The words hit the air heavier than expected. Margaret studied him, then followed his gaze to the key in her hand. Before she could speak, Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. "That key, where'd you find that?" he asked, his tone shifting. Not alarmed, but careful, like someone recognizing a sound they hadn't heard in years. Margaret hesitated, then told him about the hidden compartment under the workbench. Harold didn't respond right away. Instead, he set the grocery bag down on a cleared corner of the counter and pulled out a small bundle of screws and a flashlight. "Your father hated this corner," he muttered. "Said it creaked too much when people stood too long." He walked over to the wall panel Margaret had noticed earlier, the one with newer paint, and stopped just short of touching it. "After the fire in '09, he added almost to himself, "he changed things in here." Not everyone knew what he was protecting. Margaret stepped closer, noticing for the first time the faint burn mark hidden beneath layers of paint near the baseboard. "Fire?" she asked. Harold nodded once but didn't elaborate, his jaw tightening slightly as if the rest of the sentence belonged to someone else's story. Instead, he opened the thermos and offered her a paper cup of coffee, black and strong, the kind that stung her tired hands as she took it. "Your father helped half this street," he said quietly. "But there was one night. After that night, he stopped talking about certain people." His eyes flicked toward the ledger page on the floor, then away again, as if it had confirmed something he didn't want to fully say out loud. Margaret knelt to pick up the torn page, and as she smoothed it under the weak light, she saw Harold's name written faintly in the margin, along with a second note she couldn't yet read clearly. She looked up at him, but he was already watching her, not with suspicion, but with something heavier, recognition mixed with caution. "You're standing in something that still remembers him," he said finally, voice low. Then he tapped the wall beside the hidden panel once, softly, like a warning or a memory, and added, "Some things in here were never meant to stay buried." The silence inside the garage changed after Harold left. It didn't feel empty anymore, just paused, like something was listening through the walls. Margaret stood near the workbench, the torn ledger page still damp from her grip, while her eyes tracked every detail Harold had pointed out before disappearing down the gravel road. The rain had started again, softer now, tapping against the tin roof in uneven rhythm, and somewhere deeper inside the structure, a faint metallic echo answered back, too regular to be the wind. She turned on her flashlight, sweeping it slowly across the far wall where the newer paint patch stood out like a scar trying to hide itself. Up close, the difference was undeniable. The boards beneath it didn't align perfectly with the rest of the structure, and a thin vertical seam ran down its edge, almost invisible unless the light hit it at the right angle. Margaret pressed her palm against it, cold, too smooth compared to the surrounding wood. She stepped back, remembering Harold's words. After the fire in '09, things changed here. And suddenly the burn mark she saw earlier near the baseboard didn't feel like damage anymore, but like a boundary. She moved to the side locker row, noticing for the first time that one of them had bolts installed in reverse, the heads facing inward instead of outward, as if someone had deliberately made it harder to remove. When she tried opening it, it stuck halfway, releasing a dry, hollow sound from within the metal shell. Margaret frowned and knocked on the side panel again, firmer this time, and the sound returned. Not wood, not metal, but space. Behind her, the old radio on a shelf crackled to life for half a second, emitting static before dying again, as if responding to the disturbance. She glanced toward the door instinctively, half expecting Harold to return, but only the wind slipped through the cracks, dragging cold air across the concrete floor. Still, something felt wrong in a way she could not explain logically. She pulled out the torn ledger page again and compared it with the wall, tracing the faint marks where it had once been pinned longer than it should have been. A pattern began to form. Lines in the map Harold had mentioned, the uneven paint, the hollow echo, all converging toward the same section of wall. Margaret grabbed a screwdriver from the workbench, its handle worn smooth by years of use, and began carefully probing the seam between two boards. First, nothing gave. Then, on the third attempt, the screwdriver slipped slightly inward with a soft click, as if catching onto something hidden just behind the surface. She froze. The rain outside slowed for a moment, and in the sudden quiet, she heard it clearly. A faint mechanical latch shifting somewhere deep inside the wall, followed by the subtle release of pressure, like a lock that had finally acknowledged its key after years of silence. Margaret took a deep breath, gripping the small brass key that had led her here, and knelt before the seam in the wall she had discovered. The screwdriver slipped carefully into the crack, levering the panel just enough for her fingers to catch the edge. With a gentle tug, the panel popped open, revealing a shallow cavity lined with dusty cedar, the faint scent of oil and old paper wafting out. Inside lay a small envelope, yellowed at the edges and tied with a frayed piece of twine, its paper brittle but intact. She hesitated for a moment, brushing the dust from the envelope with her sleeve, and then slowly unfolded it. Inside was a folded sheet of ledger paper, corners curled, coffee stains smudging the numbers in places, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's careful, slightly slanted script. Margaret's heart skipped when she saw a familiar name written near the top, one she hadn't seen in years, followed by a date that didn't make sense, well before her own memory of events at the garage. A column of numbers repeated the sum of $1,250, written 3 times in careful increments, as though marking installments she could not yet understand. Her fingers trembled as she noted the signature at the bottom, slightly corrected as if her father had been interrupted mid-note. She sat down on the dusty floor, pulling the ledger close to her chest, trying to make sense of the small, precise handwriting. She traced a line across the page with her fingertip, the paper crackling softly, and for a brief second imagined it was nothing more than an old bookkeeping error. But the address listed on the sheet matched the parcel number on the deed in her coat pocket, the same parcel that had caught her attention days earlier. Her pulse quickened. She reached for her phone with only 3% battery left, hesitating before dialing Harold, but stopped, tucking the envelope into her coat instead, as if keeping it close would let the garage's silence speak to her. She glanced back at the cavity, noticing for the first time a faint pencil mark along the cedar lining, a small arrow pointing toward the far corner of the wall. Margaret's lips parted, holding her breath, realizing that this ledger was not just a relic. It was a clue tied directly to her family, her father's plans, and the garage she now stood in. And at the bottom of the page, in neat, looping handwriting, a single line made her stomach tighten. Margaret and Mlynn, Route 11, Goshen County. Margaret sat on the cold garage floor, the envelope still open in her lap, the ledger page trembling slightly between her fingers as if it carried its own memory. The pencil mark pointing toward the far corner of the wall no longer felt like a suggestion. It felt like direction. Outside, rain pressed harder against the tin roof, turning the entire structure into a muted drum of sound, and the flickering bulb above her head cast slow, unstable light across the dusty space. She carefully unfolded the ledger again, tracing the slanted handwriting until her eyes stopped on the name written near the top. Her father's signature, unmistakable, followed by small annotations that looked less like bookkeeping and more like quiet records of help given when no one was supposed to be watching. Harold's words echoed back in her mind as she pressed the page closer. Your father helped people here. She had thought it was sentiment. Now it felt like evidence. A faint smell of old soap and machine oil still lingered in the cedar cavity where the envelope had been hidden, and as she leaned closer, She noticed a second paper tucked behind the ledger sheet. An older receipt, stamped from a local pharmacy, listing payments for insulin and medical supplies under names she did not recognize at first. Harold reappeared in her memory without warning. His hesitation when speaking certain words now sharper in hindsight, like he had been avoiding stepping too close to something fragile. She exhaled slowly, rubbing her thumb over the ink until she realized one of the names on the receipt matched an entry in the ledger. Partial payments marked, covered by EM, repeated across multiple months. Her throat tightened. This was not business bookkeeping, it was quiet intervention. She stood and walked to the workbench where Harold had tapped earlier, running her hand along the edge until she found a loose nail and a scratch beneath it that aligned perfectly with the arrow in the cedar lining. When she pressed lightly, the wall gave a subtle hollow sound again, deeper this time, like something breathing behind it. She stopped, listening, and for a moment the only noise was the rain and the distant crackle of the dying radio. Then she noticed it. The ledger included a second set of initials, partially crossed out but still visible beneath correction ink, and Harold's name appeared there too, not as a witness but as someone listed under assistance allocation, followed by a date she recognized as the same year her father stopped speaking about certain people in town. Margaret sat back down slowly, the realization settling in uneven layers rather than one sharp truth. Her father had not simply left her a garage. He had been quietly maintaining something far larger, something that had required silence to survive. The ledger trembled in her hands as she turned the page again, revealing one final handwritten line at the bottom, slightly smudged but deliberate, as if written in a moment someone expected to be erased. If anything happens to me, make sure Margaret never pays for what I protected her from. Margaret stood in the corner of the garage, the ledger pressed against her chest, heart hammering as she traced the faded pencil marks pointing toward the rear wall. The rain had slowed, leaving thin rivulets along the roof that dripped into puddles, echoing across the concrete. She carefully folded the ledger and placed it into her tote, then retrieved the deed from her coat pocket, flattening the crumpled paper on the workbench. The parcel number matched the red-circled notation on the old county map she had brought along, and she could hardly believe the alignment of the property description, the ledger entries, and her father's handwriting. Her fingers shook as she noted an additional clause on the deed she had overlooked: mineral rights reserved under the name Earl R. Mlin, granting access to a section of land adjacent to the garage. A small plot previously assumed worthless, now tied to decades of investment, trust accounts, and community easement agreements. Margaret's breath caught as she realized the ledger also contained repeated entries for contributions to a local fund, effectively documenting her father's quiet protection of tenants and neighbors from eviction, fraud, and predatory practices. She pulled on her raincoat, boots squelching against the puddled floor, and drove the 10 miles to the county records office, holding her papers tight, fingers tracing her father's signature for confirmation. The clerk glanced up, surprised to see the long and used parcel number, then murmured, "Huh, nobody's touched this file in years. Are you sure about this?" Margaret nodded silently, comparing signatures and old bank envelope stubs with the ledger. Each match tightened the knot in her stomach. She left the office with copies in hand, the gray light of late afternoon turning wet asphalt to glass, and immediately felt the weight of exposure. A black SUV had paused at the end of the street near the garage, engine off, tinted windows reflecting her movement back at her. A polite voice on the phone later that day, belonging to a developer she had never met, suggested she consider selling quickly. "We're only trying to help. That place is unsafe for anyone." Even her husband's lawyer had called to inquire, mentioning casually, "You don't understand what you're holding. Could complicate matters." Margaret tucked the copies into her bag, feeling the ledger's heavy truth alongside the deed, and as she looked back at the garage from the office parking lot, she noticed the old auctioneer's truck slowly turning into the driveway, dust rising from the gravel. His presence, benign at first glance, made her stomach twist. The person who once mocked the garage as worthless had returned, eyes lingering on the same corner where she had first found the hidden ledger. And now, suddenly, the place was not just an abandoned building. It was a target. The garage felt different when Margaret returned. No longer just empty space, but something exposed, like a wound someone had started probing. The copies from the county records office were still damp from the rain when she laid them across the workbench, flattening them carefully under a rusted wrench so they wouldn't curl. Her eyes moved between the deed, the ledger copies, and the old map she had photographed earlier, and for the first time, the pattern felt too precise to be coincidence. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end was calm, controlled, almost courteous, her husband's lawyer. Margaret, I hope you're well. I'm calling regarding a misunderstanding about the garage property. He paused, as if choosing words carefully. There appears to be new information suggesting it may hold significant value. The way he said value made her stomach tighten. Not concern. Interest. Ownership. He continued, explaining that a developer group was reviewing the parcel due to updated zoning and land access records. And that, for everyone's benefit, they were prepared to offer a quick settlement before complications arose. Within hours, a second call came. Not from him, but from her ex-husband himself. His tone was softer, almost familiar, like a version of him she had not heard in years. Margaret, this is about fairness, he said. You know, I never wanted things messy between us. If that land is worth what they're saying, then it should be handled properly. For the family. The word family landed like something carefully placed on a table already cracking. By evening, an official envelope appeared taped to the garage door. Notice of property review and safety compliance. A second paper underneath cited, structural risk assessment, pending possible municipal intervention. Margaret stood in the doorway reading it as wind pushed cold air through the broken panels. Her hands steady only because she refused to let them shake. Inside, she carefully folded the original ledger pages and placed them inside the metal toolbox her father used to keep locked, then slid it beneath the workbench where the cavity had first been opened. She took photos of every document with her phone until the battery dropped to 12%, her finger hovering over each page like she was memorizing something that might disappear. When she stepped outside for air, she noticed tire tracks that hadn't been there before circling the gravel entrance. Too clean, too deliberate. Later that night, another message arrived on her voicemail, this time from a county official she had never spoken to. Mrs. Mlin, there appears to be a clerical discrepancy regarding the deed history. Please bring all originals to the office immediately. Beneath it, almost hidden in the paperwork she had copied earlier, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A witness line on one of the archived copies, a name partially stamped and then crossed out, dated the same night her father's ledger entries abruptly stopped. And as she stood there in the dim light of the garage, holding the copies close to her chest, she realized that someone else already had access to parts of this record she had never been shown, and that the version of the truth she was holding might be the only thing standing between her and a property everyone suddenly wanted erased from her hands. The County Records Conference room felt colder than Margaret remembered, even though nothing in it had changed. The same fluorescent lights, the same polished table, the same stack of legal folders arranged with bureaucratic precision. But today the air carried something heavier, attention. Across from her sat her husband, his lawyer, and a county official she had never seen before, each of them positioned like they already understood the outcome. The developer's representative was there too, sliding a glossy proposal folder across the table labeled Rehabilitation Acquisition Plan, Parcel 11B. Margaret placed her father's ledger on the table without ceremony. No drama, just wait. The room didn't react immediately, but she noticed the shift. The way the county clerk's pen stopped moving midline. The way the developer's smile tightened before it fully formed. This property has unresolved compliance issues. The lawyer began smoothly, tapping a document stamped with municipal code violations. It's structurally unsafe and, frankly, misrepresented in earlier filings. Any claims of historical value are... Margaret opened the ledger to the marked page. She didn't raise her voice. She simply slid it forward. Harold stood near the back of the room, silent until now, when he finally stepped closer. That handwriting, he said quietly, pointing at one entry. I've seen that before. The developer shifted in his seat. With respect, old receipts and personal notebooks don't override county records, he said, sliding a copy of the deed forward. This is the official chain of title. Margaret didn't touch it. Instead, she placed a second document beside it, the archived deed copy she had retrieved, with a witness line visible under the dust of time, a name partially stamped but still readable. The room went still. The county official leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "That witness signature?" he murmured, flipping through older files that had been brought in only minutes earlier. The lawyer cleared his throat. "That's clearly an archival error. These inconsistencies are not uncommon in older rural filings. They do not establish ownership." Then Margaret placed the final piece on the table. The pharmacy receipts Harold had identified, each one cross-referenced in the ledger, each marked covered by EM, with matching dates. The developer's expression changed first, subtle, controlled, but the confidence was gone. The county official stopped speaking altogether, turning pages faster now, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. Harold stepped forward again, his voice steady. Earl didn't just run a garage. He kept people in their homes when they were about to lose everything. Those records match county assistance gaps from 09 to 14. You can't erase that with zoning paperwork. The lawyer tried one last time, leaning back as if reclaiming authority. "Even if that's true, none of this changes current legal standing. The property is unsafe, under review, and subject to eminent domain procedures." Margaret finally looked at him, not sharply, just directly, and then she placed a final page on the table, the corrected parcel map, with the red-circled boundary that matched exactly the hidden section behind the garage wall. The developer's hand moved toward the agreement form, then stopped. He didn't look up when he spoke. "We may need to pause this acquisition," he said quietly. No one argued. No one corrected him. The pen in the county official's hand froze above the paper, and for the first time, the word junk property no longer belonged to the room. As Margaret gathered her documents, she realized something irreversible had shifted. Not just ownership, but direction. And the only question left was what she would do with a place the entire room had just been forced to admit was never empty at all. Margaret pushed open the garage door that had once groaned under decades of neglect, and for the first time, the sunlight poured through the cracked windows without hesitation, bathing the dusty floor in warmth. She placed the brass key on the workbench, polished clean now with oil and cloth, and realized it had transformed from a mere object into a symbol of endurance, connection, and inheritance. Not just of property, but of trust, purpose, and remembrance. Across the room, she rehung the faded service sign, straightened the crooked shelves, and placed her father's Polaroid on the counter, smiling faintly as if he were approving from some unseen corner. The ledger indeed had been formally corrected. Signatures verified, parcel numbers aligned, mineral rights restored to her name, and the trust account her father had quietly funded was finally accessible, ready to support not just her own future, but neighbors in need, families struggling with rent, and children whose parents could not protect them. The county officially dismissed the developer's petition. Her husband's lawyer called with a muted tone acknowledging procedural errors, and even the auctioneer who had once laughed at the garage had come by to nod, a subtle apology in his gaze. Margaret carefully locked the toolbox where she had hidden the original ledger pages, the brass key now resting atop it like a crown, proof that the years of mockery, neglect, and hardship had not diminished her worth. She pulled out a small folding cot, laid down a thin blanket, and for the first time in months, let herself sink into the quiet, feeling the shelter of walls that had once been condemned. Outside, rain began to patter softly against the tin roof, a gentle rhythm of life returning. Harold appeared at the edge of the property, offering a nod and a thermos of fresh coffee, the kind that smelled like morning and safety. Margaret sipped slowly, then placed her hand over the ledger and deed, feeling the embossed county seal beneath her fingertips, the weight of every carefully kept record and note, and understood that the true inheritance was not just this land, not just the restored documents, but the reclamation of her dignity, her father's legacy, and her right to call a place home. The garage no longer smelled of decay or neglect. The air was tinged with sawdust, oil, and the faint scent of hope. As she looked out through the dusty glass at the empty street beyond, her eyes rested on the brass key, gleaming in the sun, and for the first time, she realized that what had once been considered junk was a waiting treasure, ready for the right hands, her hands all along.